Welcome, everyone. My name is Andrew Biggs. I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, where my work focuses on Social Security and retirement policy. Social Security is the largest spending program of the federal government, the largest tax most workers pay, and the largest source of income for most retirees. With its combination of old age, disability, and survivors benefits, Social Security is the closest to a cradle-to-grave program you can get in the U.S. government. And it's also underfunded by 21%, according to the 2023 Social Security Trustees Report, which was released on March 31st. In 2034, the Social Security trust funds are projected to run dry, leaving it unable to pay full promised benefits. To discuss the Trustees Report and the future of Social Security, we today have a panel that in the Social Security world needs no introduction. And in the interest of giving you all more time to hear from our panel, no introduction is pretty much what I'm going to give them. Our first panelist today will be Steve Goss, the Chief Actuary of the Social Security Administration, who will lead off with a summary of the 2023 Social Security Trustees Report. Then we'll have comments from three other distinguished panelists. We'll start with Monique Morrissey, who's an economist at the Economic Policy Institute, followed by Mark Warshawsky, a senior fellow here at AEI, and then finishing up will be Nancy Altman, president of Social Security Works. And following that, I'll ask the panelists a series of loaded questions that reflect my own biases and opinions. And then I hope we'll have time to turn to some questions sent in from our viewing audience. So with that out of the way, I'm happy to turn to Steve Goss. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you, John, for presenting the slides. If you could pop the first one up there, please. And now go to the next one, please. As Andrew indicated, the Social Security Trustees Report has come out every year starting 1941 like clockwork by law. And you can see the number 2 item here. The primary thing that's really represented in the Trustees Report, Andrew already hinted, is the so-called actuarial status of the OSI and DI trust funds. And what that really means is a message to Congress as to whether or not it appears as though the financing for the program as scheduled in current law will be sufficient to pay the benefits that are scheduled in current law. So next slide, please. So what really happened in this year's Trustees Report? The main thing is the trustees did a reassessment of their view of the future economy and relative to where the economy was projected to be back in 2020, really before the recession. And essentially it was projected to be in the same place in the 2022 Trustees Report. The trustees reassessed and decided that they think that GDP in this year, 2023, will slow a bit. And that we will then thereafter be at about a 3% lower level of GDP for all years throughout the projection period. And this does have an effect on the long-term projections for Social Security, as we see on the next slide. So the next slide, you can see, as Andrew already hinted, this year the projected reserve depletion, and by the way, that does not mean running out of money, because as Andrew indicated, we would still have about 80% of the revenue needed in the year 2034 for the combined OSI and DI funds to be able to provide the benefits at that point. Now, why did it drop? Every year, the actuarial balance changes a little bit because we have the 75-year period changing, but the primary reason is what I just mentioned, the trustees' reassessment of the level of GDP in the future. That accounts for basically the rest of the drop in the actuarial balance for this year and creates annual deficits being a little bit larger throughout all the years through 2097. Now, of perhaps even more focus is the OSI separate fund, which is projected to have its reserves become depleted in 2033. That's also 1 year earlier in last year's report for really the same reason. Now, there's a little bit of good news here. The Disability Insurance Trust Fund reserves are projected to be solid throughout the 75-year period and beyond. In fact, even in slightly better shape this year, largely because disability applications and benefit awards have been lower again in 2022 than had been expected. So next slide, please. We won't go into detail on this. Please go to the Trustees Report and you'll see lots more numbers. So if we just go to the next slide. This is just a pictorial view of the Social Security trust funds. We call these trust fund ratios. It's the amount of trust fund reserves we have at any point in time as a percentage of the annual cost of the program. And we've heard of this as really solvency. Why? Because if our trust fund reserves hit 0, then we reach a point where we would only have coming in still the amount of money that is provided by current tax rates. We would not have any reserves to dip into, basically the savings account for Social Security, to be able to pay. The blue lines you can see are for the disability insurance program, which obviously are looking in great shape. We're in looking in good shape out in the future, but that wasn't always the case. You can see a couple of points back in around 1995 and 2015, where the DI reserves were projected to go down. And this really then speaks to why we look a lot at the OESI and DI program on a combined basis. Because you can see in 1995 and 2015, the Congress saw DI was looking like it was running low on money. And so there was a little shift in the allocation of our total tax rate between the two to sort of pull DI back up. Obviously, it did a very good job of that. And now OESI is really what's in our sights for having to be most addressed by 2033. And by the way, for the combined program, there's been a lot of stability in the projections. Over the last 30 years, the reserve depletion date for the combined OESDI program, now projected at 2034, has been between 2029 and 2042. So we're right kind of in the center of that range that has been put forth to the Congress over the last 30 years. Next slide, please. Here's just another view. Probably everybody here is very familiar with looking at the cost of the program and the revenue of the program coming in as a percentage of our taxable payroll. Taxable payroll is important because that's what everybody understands that your 12.4% tax rate applies to. And you can see we show the solid blue line as this rising cost level for Social Security, rising well above the red line, which is the income level. And then we have a dashed line at the point where the cost would continue to be at the level you see, but we would not be able to pay the full benefits under current law. And that's why the blue line of actual expenditures drops down to just the level of continuing income. And as mentioned already, in 2034, 80% would still be payable, and that would drop to about 74% by 2097. So next slide, please. And here it just shows what you already saw, the annual balances from one trustees report. They've gotten a little bit more negative here in the 2023 report. Next slide. Here's another way of really looking at the projected future status of the program. We sometimes refer to this as sustainability, looking at the cost and the income of the program, not in terms of percent of payroll, but in terms of the percentage of GDP. Many of our congressional members and many others tend to look more at things as a percentage of GDP than anything else. And speaking of sustainability, Social Security's cost is rising back from the period 1990 to 2008, where it was only about 4.2% of GDP, up to about 6% or just above in the future. That's a pretty hefty rise, but it's not continuing to rise. It reaches a higher level and then stays there. So there's a question, why? So the next slide, we show you a big part of the why. It's really the changing age distribution of our population. Everybody's very familiar with the baby boom generation, during which the average birth rate was about 3.3 children per woman over a lifetime, and that's dropped down since. What you see on the black line here is the ratio of the number of people in our population 65 and over divided by the number of people 20 to 64. Basically, roughly the ratio of our beneficiaries to our working age population. And you can see the blue and red lines, had birth rates stayed at the level that they had been prior to the end of the baby boom period, we would not be seeing this big rise in the age of dependency ratio. And if that were the case, then we would also not be seeing the rise in the cost rate that we've seen. So this is the primary reason, but there is one more on the next slide that we can show you. Back in 1983, the taxable maximum amount, something all are familiar with, and many, if not most of this call, actually experienced personally, currently $160,000 and change. After that, you do not pay payroll taxes in the year 2023. But that was expected back in 1983 when that level was set and decided to be indexed by the average wage. Going forward, we'd stay at about 90% of earnings falling below the taxable maximum. That did not turn out to be the case because of different rates of growth in earnings by high earners versus lower earners. We saw a big drop in that ratio by 2000 down to a little bit over 82%. And basically it's moved up and down with recessions since then, but it stayed around 82%, and that's where we project it to continue in the future. So this is about a 10% lower level of payroll tax revenue than had been anticipated back in 1983. By the way, the change in the age distribution, that was fully anticipated back in 1983. So next slide. Here we have something about birth rates. Birth rates, you can see the dramatic ups and downs we have had in them. This is actually showing it on what we call a cohort basis. That's the year of birth of women on the bottom. And for all women born in that given year, we show what their lifetime birth rate would be. And it's so far been like above 2.0. However, we are projecting that with lower birth rates recently, and not reaching up to the trustees' ultimate assumption of 2 children per woman over a lifetime until we get out to 2056. We're below this now. The trustees are assuming that we will get back to that level eventually. And of course, as with all assumptions, we will see. But this is where we're at. On next slide, please. So death rates. Death rates really, really matter a lot. You can see here what has happened in mortality rates. Most will recall that in past decades, a lot of people were expecting death rates to decline dramatically and to continue to decline dramatically over time. Well, after 2009, that wasn't so much the case. You can see the very much flattening in age, sex adjusted death rates across all ages, a big change. And you can see even our trustees' projections in 2014 and 2017, yellow and blue lines, we're projecting much bigger drops than we had. All of this pre-pandemic. So the pandemic, of course, you see the big surge in the pandemic. And basically, we are projecting that the death rates by 2025 will basically come back to about where we might have expected them to be by the trend through 2019. Next slide, please. You can see basically the same thing. This is for the under age 65. The experience since 2009, 2010 has not been as good even for a total population. Deaths of despair and lots of other things have been bad on that. Also, you can see here that the boost on the death rates, unfortunately, in the pandemic was even higher for the under 65 than others in the year 2021. That's really because we believe the Delta variant came at that time. And while seniors at that time were largely vaccinated, people under 65 were not as yet. So next slide, please. This is now for over 65, very similar picture as what you saw for the total population. Not surprisingly, because most deaths occur over age 65. Next slide, please. Here is now a really interesting finding. There's been a lot of speculation about what is going on with death rates once we clear the pandemic, because deaths have been, dare I say, selective in the pandemic. It's been largely thought that people who were, dare I say, pushed over the edge and died in the pandemic, especially at higher ages, are people who are probably the least vital of their generation, and therefore that might leave us with a healthier population after we've lost those folks when we get past the pandemic. Unfortunately, that does not necessarily appear to be the case, because there are effects from the COVID pandemic, either directly from having been infected or from all other aspects of the world we've been living in. And you can see on the black line here shows for each of these quarters in 2020 through 2022, what the death rate looked like on an age sex adjusted basis compared to the same calendar quarter in 2019, the year before the pandemic. Normally, we would expect this black line to be going down as compared to 2019 as we go into the future, but in fact not. Well, the red line is even more interesting. This is what happens from provisional NCHS data that we have as of March 20, and it shows that even excluding COVID-19, taking into account only other death rates, we are still elevated above 2019. So the hope and expectation that we would have lower death rates after the pandemic is maybe not clear. We're assuming that the selective mortality effect and the post-COVID effects will basically balance each other. We've been in that position for quite a while. So the next slide, please. This is a lot more detail. Please, this slide deck will be showed, I think, up on the EEI webpage and also on our Social Security Office, the actuary webpage afterwards. So if you want to see a lot more detail about this really interesting NCHS provisional data, please come back to this. No time for that now. Next slide, please. Here is just another look at what I mentioned earlier about the GDP. You can see on the red line here, this is where, under the trustees' assumptions, we are projected with a reassessment to have the red line dropping down to that level, about 3% below the second line above. The second line above is where we were projecting GDP for the 2020 and 2022 trustees reports. So you can see about a 3% drop in the level of GDP, starting with an economic slowdown in 2023. And by the way, the trustees are projecting a 0.7% growth in GDP. for calendar year 2023 over the prior year on the basis of what we knew and understood back in December of 2022. The good news is it looks like things so far are coming in a little better than expected, and most forecasters are now estimating that things will be better than that. So that's why we do a new trustees report every year. You can also see here on the black line where we were back in the 2010 trustees report, not fully yet at all reflecting the effects of the so-called Great Recession. And you can see the level of GDP has been progressively assumed to be somewhat lower at that point in time. And so the drop in the red line now is not anything that's extremely surprising. Next slide, please. Here's just a look of what's going on with employment. This just shows you that the employment level, this is the ratio of employment to population on an age-sex adjusted basis. And you can see that we basically, in the blue line, which was last year's trustees report, we're assuming we would be back as of now at about the same level as we were in 2019 before the pandemic, and roughly where we were even before the Great Recession, back in around 2007, 2006. We're having a little bit of a bobble down. You can see the red lines in 2023 are dropping a bit because of the assumed slowdown in the economy. We may or may not be really seeing that, but in any case, we see within a couple of years, the trustees' estimation is that we'll be back at employment rates at about the same level, which really tells you then the drop in the GDP level is a drop in output per hour worked, a drop in productivity for workers, not in employment. Next slide, please. This is just to look also at something sort of interesting. A lot of people have talked about the recession being the great people leaving the workforce, and leaving work. Well, actually, we have not seen any kind of a boost in people starting to receive benefits. These lines all show you on a year-by-year basis, all the way through 2022, the percentage of our insured population that could file for a retirement benefit that has already filed. And you can see the percentages at each age have continued to be dropping all the way through 2022. So while there's been a lot of people changing jobs in the last couple of years in the pandemic, it's really not been a matter of people leaving the workforce or leaving employment as much as some people think. If they were, they'd be coming to us for retirement benefits. Next slide, please. This is just a look on the disability side. Everybody here, I'm sure, is very familiar that we've seen a continual drop in our disability applications since 2010. And by the time we got to about 2015 or 16, we dropped below levels that we'd seen prior, even to the Great Recession, and continued to drop all the way through 2019 before the pandemic. Dropped somewhat more in the pandemic. You can see we in the trustees have been projecting these application rates to come back up substantially. We just have not seen it yet. Again, time will tell. We're constantly reassessing. And similar to this, on the next slide, you can see for disability incidence rates. This is the number of people newly awarded a benefit for disability divided by the number of people exposed, which really means insured not already receiving a benefit. Very similar. You can see these disability incidence rates have continued to drop down to levels really not seen before, even through 2019. And since 2019 and the pandemic, even lower yet. We're expecting some recovery on this, but we've continued to see this drop, somewhat surprisingly, because as most are probably aware, the Social Security field offices have been fully open for a year now. So we're a little bit surprised at this, but actually, if this continues, anything like this, wouldn't that be good news both for the trust funds, but also for the American people, if they feel that they're finding jobs that can accommodate their personal situation and they don't have a need to file for disability benefits. So next slide. You can see what's actually happened in terms of the number of people we're projecting receiving disabled worker benefits. The black line is back in the 2008, prior to any recession consideration. In the Great Recession, the red line, we exceeded that back around 2012 and 13. But the reality since then has been dramatically lower. Rather than going up to 10 million people receiving Social Security disability insurance benefits as workers, we're now down more around the 8 million level. So really a dramatic change from what expectations were just a few years ago. Good news. Next slide, please. This is just a little look at the disability, what we call prevalence rates, even with the low levels of disability incidence rate, and even with them coming back, you can see the disability prevalence rate, which is the number of people on an age-sex adjusted basis on the solid lines, the red line being the one to look at, the number of people receiving a disability benefit as a share of the number of people insured for benefits. And you can see what we're projecting is that'll basically go back to about the level that we had prior to the Great Recession, actually a little bit above. So next slide, please. And this is sort of the last content slide here. One thing the trustees did this year was to add to a table that we've had for a long, long time, showing that benefit levels from one generation to the next of new retirees, not surprisingly, we hope to most, tend to grow faster than prices. And of course, the reason for that is because Social Security's benefit formula is a wage indexed basis. So what the trustees put in here, you can see the last column by retirement at 65 and also by retirement at normal retirement age. We see basically the ratio of the benefit for a person newly starting benefits at such age to what their career average earnings levels were as being about constant at a rate. You're only seeing here for the very low earner. Please go to the trustees report and you'll see for all the other sort of, kind of illustrative benefit levels. We also just show you here finally just to have a sense on that of what these benefit so-called replacement rates look like over time and about how they look constant for people retiring at say 65 into the future. By the way, 65 is right now, it's about the average age at which people start their retirement benefits. And with that, I think we have maybe one more slide to take a peek at, which is, so where are we? As I think Andrew indicated, we need by 2034 to increase scheduled revenue for this program by about a third, reduce scheduled benefits by about a fourth, or probably more likely some combination of the two. So let's all keep talking to our representatives in Congress and make sure we get the job done in plenty of time. And the very final slide is the pitch. Please visit our website early and often, and you'll see all kinds of good stuff. And now I'm much looking forward to all the discussion of everybody else you're seeing on the screen now. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. That was a great summary of the trustees report. And I think for people who are not exposed to these issues very much, it really shows the level of complexity and the level of detail that goes into projecting Social Security's finances. I'm now going to turn to our panel of experts here. I think we're going to start with Monique Morrissey from the Economic Policy Institute. Monique, let us know what you think.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, AEI, for including me in this discussion. Steve is a hard act to follow, and before I get started on my remarks, I want to put a pitch in for, first of all, the actuary's website. I'm going to be talking about a couple of proposals for reforming Social Security, and I always go first to Steve and his team's analysis of these proposals. So any numbers that I have come directly from him, and it's really fun to look at them. I also wanted to highlight one of the slides that he mentioned, which showed the long-term damage of the Great Recession on Social Security and on the economy, and the relatively smaller damage inflicted by the pandemic recession because there was a much more robust economic policy response to the recession. So we recovered a lot more quickly, but as Steve pointed out, the economy is still long-term going to be below what it would have been absent the pandemic and the recession that it triggered. Also repeating some of what Steve said, based on the trustees report that was released last week, 75-year solvency would require increasing payroll taxes by 3.4 percentage points, going from a combined employer-employee tax of 12.4% to about 16%. This amounts to about 1.2% of GDP. Now, that's what economists do when they want to make a number look small. I admit that any percentage of GDP is big, but funding the largest source of retirement income for most Americans is a big undertaking. So a cost increase that goes just from under 5% to about 6% of GDP is very manageable. It's a manageable expense. This is not a crisis unless we let it become one. It's very important to emphasize, and again, as Steve does, that there's no long-term trend upward in Social Security costs as a share of GDP once the baby boomer retirement is behind us. As Steve points out, the main driver of the cost increase is the boomers and a declining birth rate, and that declining birth rate is projected to stabilize. So we could either raise revenues modestly, as I prefer, or we could cut benefits by about a fifth or by about a quarter if we wait until 2034. In my mind, this isn't a difficult decision. Social Security is immensely popular, and surveys have repeatedly shown that Americans across the political spectrum oppose benefit cuts and are willing to contribute more to preserve the program for themselves and future generations. So I don't see where there's a dilemma. And there shouldn't be one, but Republican policymakers are allergic to taxes, and Democrats have tried to compete by pledging not to raise taxes for those making under $250,000 a year. So the most popular reform plan to date that would have at the time fixed or closed the shortfall had at the time it garnered over 200 co-sponsors in the Democratic caucus, and it included a gradual increase in the payroll tax rate from 12.4% to 14.8%, and it would have taxed earnings above $400,000, which are currently not taxed at all, as Steve also pointed out. Well, anything above $160,200 is not taxed. This by itself would have achieved 75-year solvency, and this is the plan then proposed by the chairman of the Social Security Subcommittee, the Democratic chairman of the subcommittee at the time, John Larson, and it would have paid for benefit increases, and so that he named it the Social Security 2100 Act, because it would have gotten us through the 75-year period that the actuaries like to look at or are required to look at. But that original 2100 Act did not meet the Democrats' self-imposed prohibition on taxing anyone making under $250,000. So there's a revised version of the act proposed by former Chairman Larson, which leaves out the rate increase.
It appears that Monique may have accidentally hit her mute button.
I did. Sorry. Sorry.
Go back about 30 seconds or so. I think.
Okay, sorry. So I said that the revised Larson plan only extends the trust fund depletion date by 4 years, but it does substantially reduce the deficit, the long-term deficit. Another proposal that came out recently, and it's a version of earlier proposals from Senators Sanders and Warren, and has also many co-sponsors in both the Senate and the House, adheres to the pledge not to raise taxes on Americans earning under $250,000, but it does break another sort of unspoken rule, which is that Social Security is currently structured so that higher earners who contribute more also receive more in benefits, but they do so at a progressively lower rate. This is what is meant by a contributory retirement system. So, thus, the Larson plan, which I mentioned earlier, and most other proposals, if they lift or scrap the cap on taxable earnings, include a modest increase in benefits for those who will see a tax increase. The Sanders-Warren proposal not only breaks the links between higher contributions and higher benefits, but also taxes investment income. While I think there's some value in preserving Social Security's current funding structure, the Sanders-Warren plan not only funds Social Security for 75 years, hooray, but pays for substantial benefit increases. This includes an across-the-board increase of $2,400 a year, and I think that's a pretty convincing argument, even for a traditionalist like me. So which plan you prefer, and there are many other proposals, at least the Democrats have introduced viable plans, whereas Republicans mostly propose process changes that would make it easier to enact benefit cuts without admitting that this is the plan up front. So this includes Senator Romney's Trust Act and proposals to require Social Security to be reauthorized periodically by Congress, thus offering the debt limit hostage takers another victim, in my view. Another rumored plan by Republican Senator Bill Cassidy and Independent Senator Angus King would rely on borrowing $1.5 trillion and investing it in the stock market on behalf of Social Security. I don't have time to go into what that entails, but my quick take is that if that's such a great idea, let's fund the defense budget that way. So I want to leave you with one fact to mull on. If everyone paid the same tax rate on earnings, the same payroll tax rate on earnings, rather than capping Social Security taxable earnings at $160,200, as we currently do, the projected 75-year shortfall would vanish. I'm not saying this is the best plan. Among other things, it assumes no benefit increases to go along with the tax increases, but it's a good benchmark for judging other plans. But this is a fact that billionaires don't want you to know, even as many claim they'd be happy to forego Social Security benefits out of patriotism. There aren't many billionaires, so eliminating their modest benefits doesn't go anywhere to closing the shortfall, but taxing billionaires, the same as everyone else, goes a very long way. And a similar principle applies to plans that claim to make the system more progressive by cutting benefits among supposedly high earners and increasing benefits for low earners. This is the rationale behind the last detailed plan proposed by a Republican leader, Representative Sam Johnson, who was then chair of the Social Security Subcommittee in the House, as well as several think tank proposals. It's worth noting that the Johnson proposal would have cut benefits more than necessary to close the long-run shortfall. Invariably, the high earners whose benefits are cut are those who in other contexts the Republicans would refer to as middle class, because cutting the benefits of the truly wealthy doesn't go very far. So cutting benefits for middle-class Americans and increasing them for low earners is also a way to reframe Social Security as a safety net program for seniors, which is something we already have. It's called SSI. And SSI is woefully inadequate. Safety net programs don't have the broad support that Social Security has, which is why we need to preserve it as a program for all Americans. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Monique. Mark Warshawsky is up next.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to be part of this event. I actually will be focusing on the trustees report, one aspect of the projections with regard to the birth rate, and also putting it into a larger context of the federal budget, which we really haven't really discussed. I will say, though, there's one thing interestingly that I do agree with Monique about, and that is I think the Cassidy proposal to borrow $2-3 trillion and invest it in the stock market is probably not a very good idea. So we do agree on one thing. So next slide, please. So this data comes from an annual actuarial memo that Steve and his colleagues put out, and it provides a longer term perspective on the trustees' reports and the actuarial balance since 1983, which was the last year that the program was reformed and was put on a sound basis so that the imbalance was basically zero. And the question is, how have we gotten to the current situation, which is a deficit of 3.62 as a percent of taxable payroll? And the vast majority of it is what is called the valuation period, which is really demographics. I think Steve really described this pretty well. But basically, we lose one good year, quote unquote, and we add one bad year. And that's in terms of in the past, we had a positive cash flow, and in the future, we have negative cash flows. And now we are already in negative cash flows. So we have a less bad, and we add another worse bad. But what's interesting is that there are other causes, and the economic data and the assumptions since the last 40 years have been largely negative. There are many reasons for that. It includes productivity, it includes various labor market shortfalls. It actually also includes the disability program, although that has a couple of elements. Demographics are part of that. It is also the case that from 1983 till about 10 years ago, the program was actually in very bad shape. The disability rates were increasing, and awards were increasing, and people were staying on the program longer than they used to. That has turned around somewhat, but has not turned around entirely, and so the disability is also part of the explanation. Now, with what the actuaries showed this a couple of weeks ago was the current rate of negative 0.362. I would say that this is still optimistic because it does not consider what the reality is in terms of the fertility rate. The trustees do a sensitivity analysis. If we use a 1.69 fertility rate, which is actually above the current fertility rate, we actually get a negative 4.32 shortfall, which is probably more realistic. And that actually is much closer to what the CBO projects for Social Security. And so I think we have a situation where the trustees are gotten pretty out of whack with what CBO projects, and a big part of it is the fertility rate. So if we go to the next slide, we'll get a little more detail on the fertility rate. So this is looking at it since 1980. It has gone up and down, but if you sort of look at the line that is drawn through the data, we're on a downtrend. Fertility has declined from less than 2 to basically a little less than 1.9. If you look at the last 15 years, it's declined a lot. And this past year was 1.66. Now you might say, well, okay, that's what actually has happened, but what about the future? Maybe let's be hopeful and say, women are getting married later. Maybe they're not even getting married, but they're still going to have children later in life. Is that a likely scenario, which is really what the trustees are saying will happen? And I would say, no, it's not a likely scenario. So if we go to the next slide, this is, and I'm really invoking Steve Goss himself, when we were working together on the trustees working group, always referred to the surveys of women's expectations of how many children they would have. And as you see in this slide, it has declined quite a bit over cohorts. This is of women ages 20 to 24. Not only have the realizations for this age group declined, but their expectations have declined, which is really what we observe. I mean, it's just almost common sense in terms of what you see in society, so that women are expecting to have fewer children than they did in prior years. And that's what they expect. And the realization is always less than that. So the current realization, the current expectation is 2.09. But when you look next slide at the actual realization, not what the expectation is, it always comes below it because people, I guess, are optimistic or hopeful. But the reality is that it comes in less, and all told, it comes in about 0.4 less, up to 0.5 less. So basically what you have is, if you sort of combine all this information, a reasonable expectation would be a birth rate of about 1.6, 1.7. So therefore, the true financial gap for Social Security, instead of being 3.6, is more like 4.3 negative. So that's very important because for many reasons, because number one is that when we do get around to doing reform of Social Security, the tradition is to fill the gap over 75 years based on the actuary's estimate. It's very important to get that right because we don't want to keep on reforming because we haven't done the right expectation, the right calculations. We want to be realistic and not hopeful. And so that's important. It happens to be that these assumptions about future population are used throughout the government. In the Medicare Trustees Report, it's used in the financial report of the US government. So more broadly, in terms of the finances of the government, these demographic projections are very important, and they're used actually even outside of the government. So it's important to get this right, to get this as realistic as possible. So the next point I want to make is to put this whole problem in a broader context of the government's financial fiscal situation and the public debt. So as I mentioned, we've been cash flow negative now for many years, since 2010. And now we're actually redeeming bonds from the trust fund. So the trust fund is now shrinking. And basically, we have to borrow in order to pay off that trust fund debt. So the amount of money that is publicly held is increasing. And by the time that the trust fund is exhausted, it will increase by about $6 trillion. Now, a trillion here, a trillion there, but it is a significant amount of money. Just to put it in context, the amount of public debt held is currently about 25 trillion. So adding another 6 trillion is a lot. And no doubt that will have impact on a lot of the government's fiscal situation, interest rates, the ability to borrow, and so forth. So that I think it's important. The trustees report gives things in a very narrow, sort of isolated way, but you really have to consider what's going on in the broad, true sponsor of the Social Security program, which is the U.S. government, and its ability to borrow, and its ability to tax, its ability to do other activities, defend the country, provide other health and other benefits to the population. So, to look at it in a broader context of what's going on in the fiscal situation is very important. So go to the next slide. This gives another perspective on it, and that is this increase in debt doesn't even stop at the point when the trust fund is exhausted, but it continues because basically we have to pay interest on the debt that we have incurred, and that increases over time, and so that the amount of debt that is represented by the exhaustion of the trust fund actually continues to increase throughout the 75-year horizon. And I think, putting it in even a larger context, next and last slide, is to put it in the context, the broad context of the entire federal budget. And that is, and this is using the CBO projections, that we've incurred a lot of debt, particularly in the 2008, 2009 recession, a lot of debt in the pandemic in reaction to the pandemic. So you see on the left-hand side, really big, gigantic deficits, unprecedented deficits. But even going forward, that will continue, and it will increase rapidly. And it's because of everything else that the government does and really has not funded. So it's all the healthcare programs, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans, the subsidies for the insurance exchanges, and the defense, everything that the government does. The debt will really is exploding. And I would say that the CBO has been even a little optimistic in terms of the interest rates that will be required to pay on this debt. And I think that's very important in terms of the discussion of Social Security reform, because pretty much if we continue to delay reform till 2033, 34, that's pretty much going to be smack dab in these gigantic increases in debt deficits that the country will face. And I'm not sure that's a wise timing. It's particularly not wise for those who advocate big tax increases, because there may not be the capacity to do those tax increases. 1.2% or whatever the number is in terms of GDP is actually an enormous amount of money. And when it's competing with everything else, the timing may not be that great. So it's very unfortunate that we've wasted a lot of time thus far in solving this problem. And it's unfortunate that many still do not advocate actual proposals that can pass. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. Next, we'll go to Nancy Altman from Social Security Works.
Thanks, Andrew. Among the most important numbers in the trustees report, in my view, are ones that have gotten no attention in the extensive media coverage. So let me highlight them here. If we could, let's go back to Steve's slide 9. Please focus on the line at the top, the cost of Social Security as a percentage of gross domestic product. This year's Social Security costs 5.22% of GDP. That percentage is projected to peak at 6.3% in 2076 and to decline to just 5.99% in year 2100. In contrast, before the passage of the Affordable Care Act, the Congressional Budget Office projected the nation's healthcare costs, private as well as public. It projected that if the historical rate of increase continued, the nation would be spending 99% of GDP on healthcare in 75 years. That obviously is unaffordable. In contrast, whether we spend 6% or somewhat more or less on Social Security is a matter of values, not affordability. So how should we eliminate the projected shortfall? I think it's essential that we do not approach the question as simply an arithmetic problem, or worse, an exercise in splitting the baby. As important as eliminating the shortfall is, it is, after all, simply a means to an end. The goal is to permit working families to maintain their standard of living when wages are lost in the event of old age, disability, or death. When compared to tax-favored employer-sponsored defined benefit and defined contribution plans, Social Security is strikingly superior. It is much more efficient. Less than a penny of every dollar is spent on administration. More than 99 cents are returned in benefits. It's more secure. After all, its plan sponsor, the federal government, will never go out of business and has the power to tax. It's nearly universal. Unlike other defined benefit plans, it is completely portable, making it excellent, not just for long-term workers, but for mobile workers as well. Its one shortcoming is its benefits are too low. Most experts say that retirees need around 70% of their pre-retirement income to maintain their standard of living lower income retirees a bit more, higher income a bit less. If we look at Steve's slide 25, so John, if we can move to the next slide. The graph shows, and focus on the graph shows that a worker making around $30,000 has a benefit at age 65 that replaces less than half of pre-retirement earnings. Someone earning $100,000, only around 30%. Given this and the disappearance of private sector pensions, it is unsurprising that Americans rank concerns about retirement income among their top financial worries. The good news is that as polarized as the nation is, we are united over Social Security. If we define bipartisanship the way that I think we should, areas where Republican, Independent, and Democratic voters agree, as opposed to the Washington definition of getting a handful of Republican politicians to vote with Democrats or vice versa, numerous polls show that the overwhelmingly bipartisan position is no cuts while requiring the wealthy to pay more. And though when asked, a majority say that they are willing to pay more themselves if necessary. Steve's slide 11, so John, if we can move to that one, is informative on this point. It shows the impact of income inequality, which President Obama called the defining challenge of our time. The actuaries do not project that it will increase, but they also don't project that it will decline. If you haven't seen it, Monique's colleagues at EPI have written an excellent piece showing how that inequality has undermined Social Security's financing. I also believe that it is extremely destabilizing in its own right. Given all of that, I think the wisest policy is also what the American people overwhelmingly support. Social Security has three sources of revenue, only one of which is progressive. That progressive source currently accounts for only 4% of Social Security's total revenue. Increasing Social Security's progressive revenue, just a small amount, is all that is needed. There are numerous ways this can be done without unduly burdening anyone. We have a real-life example of one possible approach. The Social Security Expansion Act legislation increases benefits substantially with no cuts, requires no one with income under $250,000 to pay a penny more, and restores Social Security to 75-year actuarial balance. I am convinced that the reason Congress has not acted over the last few decades is because until recently, they have sought to enact what the American people absolutely do not want: benefit cuts. Now that Democrats have returned to their roots of incremental expansion, I believe real progress will be made because their approach involves what their constituents want. They can discuss it openly. If President Biden proposes a plan, which the Democrats will absolutely unite behind, the Republicans will have to offer one of their own or implicitly support an automatic 20% cut around 2034. That will make Social Security a voting issue in 2024, as it should be. If the voters react as numerous polls suggest, those wanting to remain in federal office will do what their constituents want. When that happens, Steve and his colleagues can prepare a report showing that this vital institution is once again in long-range balance, and that will be done with no cuts to working families' economic security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I appreciate your comments. Before I get to my own questions, I was wondering whether Steve would have any thoughts on Mark's presentation, specifically the issue of projecting fertility or birth rates going forward. I will say I do want to leave plenty of time for questions. So if Steve, you could just take a couple minutes to run over that. I'm sure you've got things to say. But I also think you're muted, so we want to hear the things you have to say.
Thank you very much. Don't want to take up all the time available and hitting the unmute button. Thanks. And Mark, Mark, we've known each other a while, and definitely an issue on birth rates. One little, tidbit back in history, a lot of people will probably remember the trustees actually did lower their assumption about the ultimate birth rate below 2.0 back in around the late 1980s, because we had a period between 1965 and 1990 in which the birth rate did drop significantly below 2.0. But then lo and behold, by 1990 and through 2008, prior to the Great Recession, it came back to or above 2.0. So is it possible that the world we're in it now, the way people are thinking, lack of childcare, et cetera, has contributed towards lesser birth rates that we might recover from? The other thing I would just mention, Mark, and I know you know this very well, that if we have a birth rate in a given year, it doesn't have any effect on the workforce, and certainly not the benefits until at least 20 years later. So actually, a lower birth rate is slightly positive for our projections, because our model suggests that a lower birth rate means that more women will have less children and will be more in the labor force. So bottom line is, because we have only a very gradual rise by out to 2056 in the birth rates, the low birth rates we've seen to date, and those that we're really still expecting to exist for the next 10 years or so, will be affecting the cost rates that we're projecting for a large portion of the next 75 years. In fact, if you look at the graph of the cost as percentage of GDP or percentage of payroll, you see it actually continues to rise up through about 2050 or 60. And only after that does it start to drop down as the higher birth rates eventually start to generate more people who are of working age. So it's definitely a concern. We are very much looking forward to seeing what's going to happen. Other tiny little technical thing, Mark. Hey, by the way, you mentioned that the changing valuation period. We actually don't give up a good year in the past. Remember, because a part of the actuarial balance reflects what the trust fund balances are to date. So, but you're exactly on point when you say we add one shortfall year each year when we go to our valuation period. And the last point really is, please everybody keep in mind that Social Security with respect to debt, Social Security's current revenues, its current trust fund reserves of about $2.8 trillion actually are part of the total debt subject to limit, because the general fund has borrowed $2.8 trillion from Social Security. So even if it comes to pass that we have no legislation between now and 2033, 2034, and trust fund is forced to sort of redeem all of that money in addition to the payroll taxes, that'll be $2.8 trillion. But keep in mind that if we reach that point of trust fund reserve depletion, Social Security does not have any borrowing authority in the law. It never has, and it's not expected to in the future under current law. So Social Security cannot per se, as many people in budget scoring assume, will not be able to pay the full scheduled benefits after reserve depletion, meaning that it will not have access to the money available to be able to pay them, and cannot put further, dare we say, pressure or increase on debt. I think, Mark, I'm pretty sure what you had did not fall prey to that, because I think you were just simply looking at on a dollar level what happens with the interest borne. But do keep in mind, looking at debt held by the public is only a part of the picture. The $2.8 trillion that Social Security is now loaned to the federal government, like the Medicare fund, is money that would otherwise have to have been borrowed from the public. And we believe that financial markets understand this.
Well, thank you very much.
Hopefully it won't be a surprise.
I want to, in the few minutes we have left, I want to ask a question about the politics of Social Security, which is usually a dangerous thing to policy people. This was not one of my pre-planned questions, but listening to both Monique and Nancy arguing that what people want is essentially a primarily or entirely sort of tax fix to Social Security, retaining or even increasing benefits while raising taxes. And you have definitely seen a shift to the left in Social Security politics over the last 20 years. When I worked in the Bush administration, Republicans, really wanted to fix Social Security entirely on the benefit side with no tax increases. Today is the first time I can think of where you have both leading presidential candidates, current President Biden and former President Trump, who pledged no reductions at all to Social Security benefits. And they're both using it to beat up their political opponents. President Biden's beating up congressional Republicans. Former President Trump's attacking Florida Governor Ron DeSantis over this issue. But there's an interesting thing, and this gets to the politics of it. Neither Biden or Trump have proposed the tax increases necessary to keep that promise. Specifically, the President Biden's tax pledge of tax increases only on people earning $400,000. He can get maybe an extra 5 years of solvency before benefits cuts would kick in. He can't get more than that. President Trump is not at all clear what he would do. So the question on the politics, I usually assume that politicians know their own business. And the part of the shift to the left on benefits has been, okay, we don't want to cut benefits. At the same time, though, they are unwilling to increase taxes to do it. So they think that shift to the left has been just incomplete. I guess my question to the three of you is, how do you think this plays out? In the sense that, obviously you have your preferences, but how do you think it plays out in the sense of we have politicians who have made pledges that are mathematically incompatible with each other? They say, no benefit cuts, but also a real limit on tax increases. Over the next, 10 years, how do you think this works its way through the political process? Maybe let's just start with Monique and then go to Nancy and then thoughts from Mark.
Well, first I want to put this in context, which is the reason that it used to be that it was assumed that a compromise was some benefit reductions, some tax increases, and that you meet in the middle. But if you consider that we had benefit cuts that were instituted in 1983, a benefit increase, so to speak, is actually restoring previous cuts, more or less. And maintaining current benefits and simply paying for them, I would say, is a compromise, not, is already a compromise, because I think that they should be expanded, especially in the context of what Nancy mentioned, which is that our employer-based retirement system is not working very well. So the 1983 cuts came at a time when we were shifting from traditional pensions, which are sort of going away in the private sector, to 401k plans, haven't really replaced them. A lot of workers really don't have private sector benefits, or employer benefits. So this is the important context, is that we have seen a reduction in cuts. What I want to see is at least restoring those cuts. But even if all we do is pay for the current benefits, it's still a big compromise. As far as whether or not this is a political loser, the Democrat, Representative Larson has been very, very frustrated by his inability to get a vote on this. And I think there was a decision by the Democratic leadership that they were taking on so much, and they do get kind of a little, there was sort of, they had hearings where they would get slammed for raising the payroll tax rate. I think that they should have stuck to their guns, said, yeah, we're raising payroll taxes. That's fine. I think actually people will believe that Social Security is safe when they have to pay a little bit more. I also want to see, the limit scrapped. But I think that it's actually helpful, useful politically for people to have to pay a little bit more. They will trust that Social Security is going to be there and that they're paying towards it. So I think that it was also just a difference of opinion within Democrats. And I also see that it's possible that this is something that's going to happen ahead. It might be like minimum wage, which is another very politically popular thing that didn't happen when the Democrats had control of both houses and the presidency, that it might be something that they bring up closer to the election. And I certainly hope so.
Got it. We have about 2 minutes left, unfortunately. I should have shorter introductions. So Nancy, could you be very quick? So I'd like to
very quick. Two just very quick points. One is that as Monique said, restoration of the benefits, I would call it restoration of the politics, that the historically the Democrats have been where they were and they shifted to the right and now they've restored. But in the terms of the taxes, they've proposed lots of taxes. The president has proposed a minimum tax on billionaires that could be dedicated to Social Security. They've imposed repealing the Trump tax cuts that could be dedicated to Social Security. Representative Wyden has proposed treating wealth like wages, and he does dedicate that to Social Security. Senator Van Hollen has proposed the estate tax dedicated to Social Security. So they're not afraid to propose it. They have, and I think those are all ideas that could.
Could I give just a last minute to Mark before they
yes,
cut me?
sorry.
Yes, thank you. That's why I emphasize the larger budget context. These what are being proposed are very large tax increases, which may be appropriate in the larger budget situation. But there's so many needy children, if you will, for these taxes, for these revenues. There's Medicare, there's Medicaid, there's defense, there's so many others. It's unclear that it should all be devoted to Social Security, because basically, if you raise the taxes like these proposals, that's all you're going to get. I mean, even those amounts, for example, the Sanders Warren proposal, which has massive tax increases on a lot of other sources besides payroll. I mean, it's almost impossible to think economically that it could be imposed because they're so large. So I think we need to be realistic in terms of the politics as well as the economics, and in terms of the program itself. The program does have a logic that benefits are related to what you pay in. That goes way back to FDR, and I think there is a good logic and politics and social aspect to it that I think we really we may need to break it a little bit, but to break it a lot, I think would be a mistake.
Well, thanks, Mark. Yeah, I mean, one way I would put it, if I were, addressing this to a progressive, would be, if you had the opportunity to get a once in a generation tax increase on high earners, something like eliminating the tax cap for Social Security, which is a roughly 12 percentage point effective tax increase on the high end, would you use it only for Social Security, or would you use it for Medicare for all or Green New Deal or whatever? And it's just the recognition that there's limited resources there. But we've hit the end of our time. This has been, I think, very informative and very enjoyable. And I'm glad to all of my panelists for joining me today. And I think there's been a real benefit to all the people the opportunity to tune in and hear your thoughts on Social Security. So I hope to keep talking about this in months to come, hopefully not years to come, because I'd like to get this around later. At the same time, I still have a kid to put through college, so there are upsides to delay as well. Thank you again, and please tune in to other AEI events.